Okay, hello everybody. I think the stream should be back up as far as mic quality is concerned, and hopefully we'll be hearing some music in a second as well. Before I get back to the paragraph that I left off on, if I could just get somebody to let me know if the audio quality has been fixed with the reset. Okay, thank you, T. Clark. He thought that everything in life ran more smoothly if people did, almost by itself as it were, without the need to think too hard about it. Of course, such behavior does not make people good, but it helps them stay good. For Confucius had a very good opinion of humanity. He said that all people are born honest and good, and that deep down they remain so. Anyone seeing a small child playing near a water's edge will worry lest he fall in, he said. Concern for our fellow human beings and sympathy for the misfortunes of others are inborn sentiments. All we need to do is make sure that we do not lose them. And that, said Confucius, is why we have families. Someone who is always good to his parents, who obeys them and cares for them, and this comes naturally to us, will treat others in the same way, and will obey the laws of the state in the same way that he obeys his father. Thus, for Confucius, the family, with its brotherly and sisterly love and respect for parents, was the most important thing of all. He called it the root of humanity. However, he didn't just mean that respect and obedience should be shown only by a subject to his ruler, and not the other way around as well. On the contrary, Confucius and his disciples often came up against obstinate princes, who would usually tell them exactly what they thought of them. For a prince must take the lead in observing the forms. He must demonstrate a father's love to providing for his people and to deal with them justly. If he neglects to do so and brings suffering on his subjects, then it serves him right if they rise up and overthrow him. So taught Confucius and his followers. For the prince's first duty was to be an example for all who lived in his kingdom. It may seem to you that what Confucius taught was obvious, but that's not exactly his intention. Sorry guys, I thought the alerts came off. Thank you to whoever followed. I'll bring up the name as soon as the chapter's done. He wanted to teach something that everyone would find easy to grasp because it was just so fair. Because it was so just and so fair. Then living together would become much easier. I've already told you that he succeeded, and, thanks to his teaching, that enormous empire with all of its provinces was saved from falling apart. But you mustn't think that in China there weren't other people more like the Buddha, for whom what mattered was not living together and bowing to one another, but the great mysteries of the world. A wise man of this sort lived in China at about the same time as Confucius. His name was Lao Tzu. He's said to have been an official who became tired of the way that people lived at court, so he gave up his job and wandered off to the lonely mountains at the frontier of China to become a hermit. A simple border guard at a frontier pass asked him to set down his thoughts in writing before leaving the world of men, and this Lao Tzu did. But whether the border guard could make any head or tail of them I do not know, for they are very mysterious and hard to grasp. Their meaning is roughly this: in all the world, in wind and rain, in plants and animals, in the passage from day to night, in the movements of the stars, everything acts in accordance with this great law. This he calls the Tao, which means the way or the path. Only man in his restless striving, in his many plans and projects, even in his prayers and sacrifices, resists, as it were, this law, obstructs its path and prevents its fulfillment. Therefore, the one thing we must do, said Lao Tzu, is do nothing. Be still within ourselves. neither look nor listen to anything around us, have no wishes or opinions. Only when a person has become like a tree or a flower, empty of all will and purpose, will he begin to feel the Tao, that great universal law which makes the heavens turn and brings the spring begin to work within him. This teaching, as you see, is hard to grasp and harder still to follow. Perhaps in the solitude of the distant mountains, Lao Tzu was able to take doing nothing so far that the law began to work within him in the way that he described. But maybe it's just well and good that Confucius and not Lao Tzu became the great teacher of his people. What do you think? So we are going to begin the greatest adventure of all, but I need to give some credit to some people coming in here. Hello, Jesse Quill. Thank you everybody for stopping by the way. Very special hello to Zhenya, if she's listening. Sorry to break up the narrative for a bit, but because I did hear the follow sound, I will bring up my dashboard to see who followed. And then we'll jump on to... Well, let's hear some suggestions in chat. Who do you think gets the title of the greatest adventure of all? Thank you to everybody, actually, by the way, in terms of coming in. It's always nice to see a healthy turnout for a unique stream. We won't be doing any gaming tonight. We'll just continue to be reading the book. And by the way, Jesse, I'm sorry to hear about anxiety, but I'm very glad to hear that my interrupted story is carrying through. Sky Breather, thank you very much for that follow. Apologies, guys, if I don't respond as much as everybody would like. All right. Greece's age of splendor was short-lived. The Greeks could do everything but live in peace with one another. Above all, it was Athens and Sparta who could not put up with one another for long. By 430 BC, the two states were locked in a long and bitter conflict. This was the Peloponnesian War. The Spartans marched on Athens, savagely laying waste to the countryside all around. They uprooted the olive trees, and this was a terrible misfortune because it takes years for a newly planted olive tree to bear fruit. The Athenians hit back, attacking the Spartan colonies to the south of Italy at the Syracuse and Sicily. There was a great deal of fighting and retaliation, a terrible plague in Athens in which Pericles died, and in the end Athens lost the war and the city walls were torn down. As is usually the case with wars, not only Athens but the whole country was exhausted by the conflict, and the victors were no exception. To add to it all, a small tribe near Delphi, provoked by the priests of the oracle, invaded and plundered the sanctuary of Apollo. Utter confusion followed. A foreign tribe, though not so very foreign, took advantage of this confusion to interfere. These were the Macedonians, a people who lived in the mountains to the north of Greece. The Macedonians were related to Greeks, but they were barbarous and warlike. Their king Philip was a man of great cunning. He spoke excellent Greek and was familiar with Greek customs and culture. His aim was to be king of all Greece. Since the invasion of the sanctuary at Delphi concerned all tribes loyal to the Greek religion, he had a good excuse to intervene. There was a politician in Athens, however, who was suspicious of Philip and of Macedon. This was the famous orator Demosthenes, whose fulminating speeches in the assembly, in which he repeatedly warned the people against King Philip's schemes, are known as Philippics. But Greece was too divided to put up any real defense. At Chaeronea in 338 BC, the Greeks, who hardly 100 years before had held their own against the gigantic Persian host, were defeated by King Philip in tiny Macedonia. So ended the freedom of the Greeks, not that it could be said that they had made any good use of it lately. But it wasn't Philip's intention to enslave or plunder Greece. He had other ideas. He planned to create a great army made up of Greeks and Macedonians with which to invade and conquer Persia. At the time of the Persian Wars, such a task would have proved impossible, but things had changed. The great kings of Persia were no longer able and ambitious like Darius or mighty like Xerxes. They had long given up ruling the country themselves and had contented themselves with the money their satraps sent back from the provinces. They used it to build themselves magnificent palaces and held court in great style. They ate off golden dishes, and even their slaves, both male and female, were dressed in splendid robes. They loved good food and good wines even more. So did the satraps. A kingdom like this, thought King Philip, should be easy to conquer. But before he had even completed the preparations for his campaigns, he was assassinated. His son, who now inherited the whole of Greece, along with his native Macedonia, was barely 20 years old at the time. His name was Alexander. The Greeks were convinced that freedom was in their grasp. He was only a boy, and they'd make short work of him. But Alexander was no ordinary boy. From his youth, he had been impatient to be king. When he was little, he was said to cry whenever his father, King Philip, conquered another Greek city, saying, "Father won't leave anything for me to conquer when I'm king." Now his father had left him everything. A Greek city that tried to free itself was razed, and its inhabitants sold into slavery as a warning to all. Then Alexander summoned all of the Greek leaders to a meeting in the town of Corinth to discuss the Persian campaign. Now Alexander wasn't just a brave and ambitious warrior. There was much more to him than that. He was exceptionally handsome, with long curly hair, and he knew just about everything there was to know at the time. His tutor was the most famous teacher living, the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And if I tell you that Aristotle wasn't just Alexander's tutor, but in a manner of speaking, the teacher of mankind for 2,000 years, you'll have an idea of what I mean. In the 2,000 years that followed, whenever people failed to agree on one thing or another, they turned to his writings. He was their referee. What Aristotle said must be right. For what he had done was to gather together all of the knowledge of his time. He wrote about the natural sciences, the stars, the animals and plants, about history and people living together in a state, what we call politics, about the right way to reason, logic, and the right way to behave, ethics. He wrote about poetry and its beauty, and last of all, he wrote down his own thoughts of a God who hovered impassive and unseen in the vault of heaven. All this Alexander studied too, and no doubt he was a good student. Best of all, he loved the stories about the heroes in Homer and the great lyric poems. They say he kept them under his pillow at night, but Alexander didn't spend all of his time with his nose in a book. He loved sport and riding more than anything. No one rode better than he. His father once bought a beautiful stallion that no one could tame. His name was Bucephalus. Whenever anyone tried to mount him, they were thrown off. But Alexander worked out why he did that. The horse was afraid of his own shadow. So Alexander turns the horse's head towards the sun so that he couldn't see his shadow on the ground. Stroking him gently, he swung himself onto the back and rode around to the applause of the whole court. From that time on, Bucephalus would always be his favorite horse. Now when Alexander appeared before the Greek leaders in Corinth, they greeted him warmly and paid him lavish compliments. All of them, that is, but one. A funny philosopher named Diogenes. He had views not unlike those of the Buddha. According to him, possessions and all the things that we need only serve to distract us and get in the way of our simple enjoyment of life. So he had given everything away that he owned, and now sat almost naked in a barrel in a market square in Corinth, where he lived as free and independent as a stray dog. Curious to meet this strange fellow, Alexander went to call on him. Dressed in shining armor and the plume of his helmet waving in the breeze, he walked up to the barrel and said to Diogenes, "I like you. Let me know your wish and I shall grant it." Diogenes, who had until then been comfortably sunning himself, replied, "Indeed, sire, I have a wish." "Well, what is it?" "Your shadow has fallen over me. Stand a little less between me and the sun." Alexander is said to have been so struck by this that he said, "If I weren't Alexander, I should like to be Diogenes." A king like this was soon as popular with the Greek soldiers as he was with the Macedonians. They were more than willing to fight for him. So with increasing confidence, Alexander marched on Persia. He gave everything he owned to his friends. They were horrified and said, "What are you leaving for yourself?" "Hope," he is said to have replied. And that hope didn't deceive him. His army reached Asia Minor first. There he came up against the first Persian army. Although larger than his own, it turned out to be no more than a milling host of soldiers with no effective leader. The Persians were quickly put to flight. So Alexander fought bravely, and Alexander most bravely of all in the heat of the fray. It so happens that vanquished Asia Minor is the scene of the famous story of the Gordian knot. It went like this. In the city of Gordium there was a temple. and in it an old chariot whose shaft was held fast by a strap that was tightly and intricately knotted. Now it had been foretold that he could untie the enchanted knot would become master of the world. Alexander wasted little time fiddling with a knot that was clearly far worse than the sort of thing that you get in your shoelace when you're in a hurry. He did something Mother never let me do. He took his sword and simply chopped through it. The story's meaning is twofold. Alexander would conquer the world in fulfillment of the ancient prophecy, and he would do it with a sword. And indeed he did. You'll find it easier to follow the rest of the story of conquest if you look at a map. Alexander could have gone on to attack Persia directly, but rather than risk an attack from the rear by the Persian provinces of Phoenicia and Egypt, he chose to subdue them first. The Persians tried to block his way near a town called Issus, but Alexander crushed them. He plundered the magnificent royal tents and made off with the king's treasure. He captured the king's wife and sisters too, and treated them with the utmost respect and courtesy. This was 333 BC, an easy date to remember. Phoenicia was less easy to conquer. For 7 long months, Alexander laid siege to the city of Tyre. Its destruction, when it came, was all the more brutal. Egypt was easier. Glad to be rid of the Persians, the Egyptians soon surrendered to Persia's foe. But Alexander was determined to be a true ruler of Egypt, the sort that they were used to. He marched across the desert to a temple of the sun god, and had the priests proclaim him son of the sun, and therefore a righteous pharaoh. Before he left Egypt to continue his campaign, he founded a new city by the sea that he named after himself, Alexandria. It is still there today, and was for a long time one of the most richest and powerful cities in the world. Only now did he march on Persia. In the meantime, the Persian king had assembled a huge army and was waiting for Alexander near ancient Nineveh at a place called Gaugamela. He sent messengers ahead to meet Alexander and offered him half the kingdom and his daughter in marriage, if only he would agree not to fight. If I were Alexander, I'd take it, said Alexander's friend Paramenos. And so would I, if I were Paramenos, was Alexander's reply. Half the world wasn't enough for Alexander. With that, he defeated the last and the greatest Persian army. The king of Persia fled into the mountains, where he was assassinated. Alexander punished the assassins. Now he was king of the whole of Persia, Greece, Egypt, Phoenicia, Palestine, Babylonia, Assyria, Asia Minor, and Persia. All of these were now part of his empire. He set about putting it in order. His commands could now be said to reach all the way from the Nile to Samarkand. This probably would have been enough for you or me, but Alexander was far from satisfied. He wanted to rule over new, undiscovered lands. He longed to see the mysterious, far-off peoples merchants talked about when they came to Persia with rare goods from the east. Like Dionysus in the Greek legend, he wanted to ride in triumph to the sun-burnished Indians of the east and there to be there to receive their tribute. Receive their tribute. So he spent little time in the Persian capital, and in 327 BC led his army on the most perilous adventures over unknown and unexplored mountain passes and down the valley of the Indus into India. But the Indians did not submit to him willingly. The hermits and the penitents in the forest denounced the conquerors from the distant west in their sermons, and the soldiers of the warrior caste fought valiantly so that every city had to be besieged and conquered in turn. Alexander himself was no less valiant, as is shown by his encounter with the Indian king. King Porus had lain in wait for him on a branch of the Indus River. With a mighty army of war elephants and foot soldiers, when Alexander reached the river, the king's army was positioned on the far bank, and Alexander and his soldiers had no choice but to cross the river in the face of the enemy host. His success was one of his greatest feats. Yet even more remarkable was his victory over that army in the stifling heat Yet even more remarkable was his victory over that army in the stifling heat of India. Porus was brought before him in chains. "What do you want of me?" asked Alexander. "Only that you treat me as befits a king." "And that is all?" "That is all," came the reply. "There is no more to be said." Alexander was so impressed that he gave Porus back his kingdom. He himself wished to march on further towards the east, so that even more mysterious and unknown people who lived in the valley of the river Ganges. But his soldiers had had enough. They didn't want to march to the end of the world. They wanted to go home. Alexander begged and pleaded and threatened to go on alone. He shut himself up in his tent and refused to come out for 3 whole days. But in the end, the soldiers had their way, and he was forced to turn back. but they did agree on one thing. They wouldn't go home by the same route. Of course, it would have been the simplest thing to do, since those regions had already been conquered. But Alexander wanted new sites and new conquests. So they followed the Indus down as far as the sea. There he put his army onto ships and sent them home that way. He himself chose to endure the new and the terrible hardships as he marched with the rest of his army over the pitiless desert wastes. Alexander bore all of these privations that his army endured and took no more water and slept no more than the next man. He fought in the frontmost ranks. On one occasion, he only escaped death by a miracle. That day they were besieging a fortress. Ladders had been set up in place to scale the walls. Alexander was the first up. He had reached the top when the ladder snapped under the weight of the soldiers behind, leaving him alone on the top of the wall. His men shouted to him to jump back down. Instead, he leapt straight into the city, and with his back to the ramparts, defended himself with his shield against overwhelming odds. By the time the others were able to scale the wall to rescue him, he had already been hit by an arrow. It must have been thrilling. In the end, they returned to the Persian capital, but since Alexander had burnt it down when he conquered it, he chose to set up his court in Babylon. This was no idle choice. Son of the sun to the Egyptians, king of kings to the Persians, with troops in India and in Athens, he was determined to show the world that he was its rightful ruler. It may not have been pride that prompted him to do so. As a pupil of Aristotle, he understood human nature and knew that power needs pomp and dignity if it wants to make it the right impression. So he introduced all the age-old ceremonies of the Babylonian and Persian courts. Anyone who came into his presence had to fall on their knees before him and speak to him as if he were a god. And in the manner of the Oriental kings, he had several wives, among them the daughter of the Persian king Darius, which made him the king's rightful successor. For Alexander didn't wish to be seen as a foreign conqueror. His aim was to combine all the wisdom and the splendor of the East with the clear thinking and vitality of the Greeks, and so create something entirely new and wonderful. But this idea didn't please the Greeks and the Macedonians at all. They were conquerors, and so they should be masters. What was more, they were free men and used to their freedom. They weren't going to bow to any man on earth, or as they put it, lick any man's boots. His Greek friends and soldiers became increasingly rebellious, and so he was forced to send them home. Alexander never realized his great ambition of mingling two peoples, even though he handed out rich dowries to 10,000 Macedonian and Greek soldiers so that they would marry Persian women, and laid on a great wedding feast for all. He had great plans. He wanted to found many more cities like Alexandria. He wanted to build roads and change the face of the world with his military campaigns, whether the Greeks liked it or not. Just imagine in those days to have a regular postal service running from India to Athens. But in the midst of all of his plans, he died in Nebuchadnezzar's summer palace in 323 BC. He was 32 years old, an age when most people's lives have barely begun. To the question of who succeeded him, he answered in his fever, "He who is most worthy." But there was no one. The generals and the princes of his entourage were greedy, dissolute, and dishonest. They fought over the empire until it fell apart. Egypt was then governed by the family of generals, the Ptolemies. The Seleucids ruled Mesopotamia, and the Attalids Asia Minor. India was simply abandoned. But although the empire was in pieces, Alexander's great project slowly went on taking shape. Greek art and the spirit of Greece had penetrated Persia and passed on through India to China. Meanwhile, the Greeks themselves had learned that there was much more to the world than Athens and Sparta, and more to do than waste their lives in endless squabbling between the Dorians and the Ionians. And having lost the little political power that they once had, the Greeks went on to be the bearers of the greatest intellectual force that there had ever been, a force that we know as Greek culture. This force was protected and preserved in some very special fortresses. Can you guess what those fortresses were? They were libraries. Alexandria, for instance, had a great Greek library that held around 700,000 scrolls. Those 700,000 scrolls were the Greek soldiers who set off to conquer the world, and that empire is still standing today. Chapter 13. New Wars and New Warriors. Alexander only went east, although only may not quite be the right word. But the lands that lay to the west of Greece did not tempt him. Just a couple of Phoenician and Greek colonies and a handful of densely wooded peninsulas inhabited by tribes of stubborn and unruly peasants. One of these peninsulas was Italy, and one of the peasant tribes, the Romans. At the time of Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire was no more than a little patch of land in the heart of Italy, and Rome a tiny city of twisting streets within strong walls. But Rome's inhabitants were a proud people. They loved recounting stories of the greatness of their past and were convinced of a great future. Their history, as they told it, went back to ancient Troy. A Trojan named Aeneas fled to Italy. His descendants were the twin brothers Romulus and Remus, sons of Mars, the god of war, who were suckled and raised in the forest by a wild she-wolf. Romulus, so the myth goes, founded Rome. They even had a date for it, 753 BC, and would later count the years from that date as the Greeks did much from the Olympiads. They would say in such and such a year after the city's founding. So, for example, the Roman year 100 is what we would call the 653rd year before the birth of Christ, or 653 BC. The Romans had lots of other stories about the glorious past of their little city, tales of kings, both good and bad, and their wars with neighboring cities. I almost said with neighboring villages. The seventh and last king was called Tarquin the Proud, and he was said to have been assassinated by a nobleman named Brutus. From that time onwards, power was in the hands of the nobility. There were patricians, the word meaning something like city fathers, although in those days they weren't citizens as we know them, but landowning families with vast estates of fields and meadows. And they alone had the right to choose officials to govern the city, once there were no more kings. In Rome, the highest officials were the consuls. There were always two of them ruling jointly, just as they held office, and they just held office for only 1 year. Then they had to stand down. Of course, the patricians weren't the only people who lived in the city, but if you didn't have illustrious ancestors or great estates, you weren't noble. The others were the plebeians, and they were almost a caste of their own, as in India. A plebeian couldn't marry a patrician, still less could he become a consul. He wasn't even allowed to voice his opinion at the People's Assembly on the Field of Mars outside the city gates. But the plebeians were many, and every inch as strong-willed and stubborn as the patricians. Unlike the gentle Indians, they didn't willingly submit. On more than one occasion, they threatened to leave the city unless they were treated better and given a share of the fields and the pastures which the patricians liked to keep for themselves. After a relentless struggle which went on for more than 100 years, the plebeians of Rome finally succeeded in obtaining the same rights as patricians. Of the two consuls, one would be a patrician, the other a plebeian. So justice was done. The end of this long and complicated struggle coincided with the time of Alexander the Great. From this struggle you will gain some idea of what the Romans were like. They were not as quick-thinking or as inventive as the Athenians, nor did they take such delight in beautiful things as in buildings and statues and poetry. Nor was reflecting on the world and on life so vital to them. But when they set out to do something, they did it, even if it took 200 years, for they were peasants through and through, not restless seafarers like the Athenians. Their homes, their livestock, and their land, these were what mattered. They cared little for travel and founded no colonies. They loved their native city and its soil and would do anything and everything to increase its prosperity and its power. They would fight for it and they would die for it. Beside their native soil, there was one other thing that was important to them: their law. Not just the law, not the law that is just and fair and before which all men are equal, but the law which is law, the law which is laid down. Their laws were inscribed on 12 bronze tablets set out in the marketplace, and those few stern words meant precisely what they said: no exceptions, no compassion, and no mercy. For these were the laws of their ancestors, and they must be right. There are many old and wonderful stories telling of the love that the Romans had for their native land and of their faithfulness to their laws. Stories of fathers who sentenced their own sons to death without turning a hair because the law so demanded, and of heroes who didn't hesitate to give their lives for their fellow countrymen on the battlefield or in captivity. While we don't have to believe every word of them, such stories give us an idea of what was expected of a Roman, the harshness and the discipline that was his duty to show towards himself and to others whenever his native land or the law were involved. Nothing could shake these Romans. They never gave up. Not even when their city was captured and burnt to the ground by tribesmen from the north called the Gauls in 390 BC. They just rebuilt it, fortified it, and gradually brought the small surrounding towns back under their control. After the time of Alexander the Great, however, small wars against small towns ceased to satisfy them, and they set about conquering the entire peninsula. Not as Alexander had done in one single great campaign, but in easy stages, town by town, region by region, and with all their characteristic single-mindedness and determination. It usually went like this. Because Rome was a powerful city, other Italian cities wanted to be its allies. This suited the Romans very well, and all would go smoothly as long as the allies behaved themselves. But if a disagreement arose that led to an allies refusing to follow Rome's instructions, it would mean war, a war in which Rome's regiments or legions usually won. Now it so happened that one day a city in the south of Italy asked a Greek prince and commander called Pyrrhus to come to its aid against Rome. He arrived with war elephants, whose use the Greeks learnt from the Indians, and succeeded in defeating the Roman legions, but at a cost. He lost so many of his men that he is said to have cried out, "One more such victory and we are lost!" Which is why people still speak of a Pyrrhic victory. If it has been won with too great of a cost. And now I realize it's Pyrrhic, not Pyrrhic. Pyrrhus soon withdrew his forces, leaving the Romans to become lords of the whole of southern Italy. But even that was not enough for them. They aimed to conquer Sicily as well, drawn by the island's fertile soil, which produced such good crops, and by its wealthy Greek colonies. But Sicily didn't belong to the Greeks anymore. It was under the control of the Phoenicians. Now, as you remember, even before the Greeks, the Phoenicians had set up trading posts and founded cities everywhere they went. These were mainly in southern Spain, along the coasts of North Africa. One of the African cities was Carthage, and it lay immediately opposite Sicily. Carthage was the richest and mightiest city for miles around, and the Romans referred to it and its Phoenician inhabitants as the Punics. Its ships went far across the seas, taking goods from one country to another, and since they were so near Sicily, they fetched grain from there. Because of this, the Carthaginians had become Rome's first real opponents, and very dangerous ones too. Unlike the Romans, they didn't usually fight themselves, but could afford to pay foreign mercenaries to fight on their behalf. In the war which now broke out, in Sicily they won early battles, not least because the Romans didn't have many ships, weren't used to sea voyages and sea warfare, and knew next to nothing about shipbuilding. But one day a Carthaginian ship ran aground off Italy. Using it as a model and working with furious haste, the Romans managed to build a whole fleet of identical ships within 2 months. It took all the money that they had, but with their brand new fleet they defeated the Carthaginians, who were soon forced to cede Sicily to the Romans. This happened in 241 BC. However, it was only the start of the war between the two cities. "They've taken Sicily," the Carthaginians said to themselves, "so we'll take Spain." Now at the time we're talking about, there weren't any Romans in Spain, only wild tribes. Even so, the Romans would not allow it. It so happens that there was a Carthaginian commander in Spain whose son Hannibal was a truly extraordinary young man. Reared among soldiers, he knew everything there was to know about warfare. Hunger and cold, heat and thirst, forced marches, night and day. He had seen them all. He was fearless, unbelievably tenacious, and a born leader. He could outwit the enemy with his cunning and sum up a situation in an instant, and he had a cool head. He was that rare thing, a man who made war like a chess player, carefully considering each move before he made it. But above all, he was a good Carthaginian. He already hated the Romans for trying to subdue his native city, and their meddling in Spain was a last straw. He left Spain immediately for Italy, equipped with war elephants and a large army, a truly formidable force. To reach Italy, he had to take his army and his elephants across the whole of southern France, across rivers and over mountains, right up over the Alps. He may have taken the pass that goes over the shoulder of Mount Cenis, as we know it today. I've been there myself, following a wide and winding road. But how they found their way over those wild mountains in those days with no roads to follow is impossible to imagine. Surrounded by deep ravines, sheer precipices, and slippery grass ledges, I wouldn't want to be up there with one elephant, let alone 40. and by then it was already September, and there was snow on the mountaintops. But Hannibal found a way for his army then they finally reached Italy. There he was confronted by the Romans, but he defeated them in a bloody battle. Later, a second Roman army surprised his camp under the cover of darkness, but Hannibal, having been forewarned, saved himself with a cunning trick. He tied flaming torches to the horns of a herd of cattle and drove them down the mountainside where his camp was billeted. In the darkness, the Roman soldiers mistook them for Hannibal's soldiers and rushed off in hot pursuit. I would love to have seen their faces when they finally caught up with them and realized that what they found were cows. The Romans had a very gifted general called Quintus Fabius Maximus, who wanted to avoid meeting Hannibal in battle. He believed that Hannibal would eventually become impatient and, being in a foreign country, was bound to make a blunder. But the Romans didn't like his waiting game and mocked Quintus Fabius Maximus, calling Concator, hesitator. Ignoring his advice, they attacked Hannibal at a place called Cannae. There they were decisively beaten, 40,000 dead on the Roman side. This battle, which took place in 217 BC, was their bloodiest defeat. Yet despite his victory, Hannibal did not march on Rome. Favoring caution, he stayed put and waited for reinforcements from home, and this would be his undoing. For Carthage sent no fresh troops, and his man began to run wild, robbing and plundering the Italian cities. Though the Romans no longer dared attack him directly, they called up all their men to fight. Every one of them, even young boys and slaves. Every man in Italy became a soldier, and those who weren't hired soldiers, and they weren't hired soldiers like Hannibal's. They were Romans, and you know what that means. They fought the Carthaginians both in Sicily and in Spain, and everywhere they fought, as long as it wasn't Hannibal they were fighting, they always won. After 14 years in Italy, Hannibal finally returned to Africa, where his countrymen needed him. The Romans, led by Scipio, their general, had reached the gates of Carthage, and there Hannibal met his defeat. In 202 BC, the Romans conquered Carthage. The Carthaginians were made to burn their entire fleet and pay the Romans a huge sum of money. Hannibal fled and later poisoned himself rather than fall into the hands of the Romans. Emboldened by this great victory, Rome now conquered Greece, still under Macedonian rule, as disunited and fragmented as ever. They brought home the most beautiful works of art from Corinth and reduced the city to ashes. Rome also expanded northwards into the lands of the Gauls, who 200 years earlier had sacked Rome. They conquered the region known as northern Italy. Yet even this was not enough. Carthage was still standing, a fact that many Romans would not accept, and in particular a patrician named Cato. Cato was a just and honorable man, but notoriously severe. Whenever the city council met at the Senate, no matter what was discussed, he said to have ended every speech with the words, "For the rest, I propose that Carthage be destroyed." And in the end, this is precisely what they did. The Romans invented a pretext to attack. The Carthaginians defended themselves desperately, and even after the city had fallen, the Roman soldiers had to fight on, house by house, through every street for 6 more days. When the city was finally conquered, every Carthaginian had been killed or captured. The Romans razed all of the houses and turned it into the land where Carthage had once turned into a plain. It was 146 BC, and that was the end of Hannibal's city. Now Rome was the mightiest city in the world. Welcome, Tony Loran and her followers. I'm sorry for the late greeting, but we're doing Ernst Gombrich's A Little History of the World tonight. I'll catch up on chat. Thank you very much for that, host. Tony Loran is a member of Team Panda. Should let you know, guys, there's not going to be any gaming tonight. This is a special makeup stream because I had to do a short cast on Monday. But if you're interested in this, we have a couple of VODs of this now. The first VOD, which covered the first 8 chapters of the book, we had about 45 minutes, and then I had some technical difficulties. And then we are continuing this book at chapter 14 once I finish greeting everybody. So let me just take a second here. Thank you, by the way, to the people who followed. I believe that was you, Jugo Lama, following again, so thank you for that. And what else do we have here? Kite is probably long gone. All right, so Tony Loran, Kirjin, Renaticus, It's Cool Insane, Chumley, T. Clark and Weebro have been here. But thank you, everybody, for stopping by. And I apologize for not talking a little bit more, but again, I don't want to break up the narrative more than I already am. And so let's hear about an enemy of history. If you have always found history boring, then you are going to enjoy this chapter. At about the same time as Hannibal was in Italy, that is shortly after 220 BC, an emperor was ruling over China who hated history so much that in 213 BC, he ordered all history books and all the old reports and records to be burnt, along with all collections of songs and poems and the writings of Confucius and Lao Tzu. In fact, everything he considered to be useless rubbish. The only books he permitted were the ones on agriculture and other useful subjects. Anybody found in possession of any other sort of book was to be put to death. This emperor was Shi Hongtai, the first emperor of all of China and one of the greatest warriors there has ever been. He was not born into an imperial family, but he was the son of one of the princes I told you about, who ruled the many Chinese provinces. His province was called Qin, from which his family took its name, and it is likely that the whole country, now known as China, was named after him. There was certainly more to him, more than enough reasons for China to take the name for the Prince of Qin. Not only did he make himself the first emperor of all of China by conquering all of the other provinces one by one, but he transformed the entire country. He threw out all the princes and totally reorganized his empire. And if you ask me why he hated history and destroyed all those books, it was because he wanted to wipe out every trace of how things had been before, so he could start and build an entirely new China, his China, starting from scratch. He built roads everywhere and began to work on an enormous project, the Great Wall of China. Today it is still a massive construction, a double wall made of stone with tall towers and castellations, winding its symmetrical way over the plains through deep ravines and up steep mountain slopes as it follows the line of the frontier for all of 4,000 miles. Xing Hongti built it to protect China's many hard-working and peaceable peasants and townspeople from the wild tribes of the steppes, whose warlike horsemen roamed the vast plains of Inner Asia. It had to be strong enough to resist their incessant raids with all their looting and killing, and he succeeded. Of course, over the centuries, the wall has often been rebuilt and strengthened, but it is still there today. Shi Hongti didn't have long to reign. Soon a new family ascended the throne as the Son of Heaven. This was the Han family. They saw no need to undo all of Xing Hongtai's good work, and under their rule, China remained strong and unified. But by now the Hans were no longer enemies of history. On the contrary, they remembered China's debt to the teachings of Confucius and set about searching high and low for all those ancient writings. It turned out that many people had the courage not to burn them after all. Now they were carefully collected and valued twice as highly as before. And to become a government official, you had to know them all. China is, in fact, the one country in the world to be ruled for hundreds of years not by the nobility, nor by soldiers, nor even by the priesthood, but by scholars. No matter where you came from or whether you were rich or poor, as long as you gained high marks on your exams, you could become an official. The highest post went to the person with the highest marks, but the exams were far from easy. You had to write thousands of characters, and you can imagine how hard that is. What is more, you had to know an enormous number of ancient books and all of the rules and teachings of Confucius and the other ancient sages off by heart. So Shi Hongti's burning of the books was all in vain, and if you thought he was right, you were mistaken. It's a bad idea to try and prevent people from knowing their own history. If you want to do anything new, you must first make sure that you know what people have tried before. Chapter 15. The Rulers of the Western World. It would never have occurred to the Romans to do what Alexander the Great had done. They had no wish to turn the lands that they conquered into a single vast empire in which everyone was treated equally. Certainly not. All the lands the Roman legions conquered, and their conquests came thick and fast, became Roman provinces, their towns occupied by Roman troops and Roman officials. These occupiers looked down on the native inhabitants, even when they were Phoenicians, Jews, or Greeks. All peoples of a very ancient culture. In the eyes of the Romans, they were good for just one thing, paying up. They were subject to crushing taxes and had to keep sending grain to Rome, as much and as often as possible. Provided that they did so, they were left more or less in peace. They could practice their own religion and speak their own language, and in many ways they benefited from all the good things that the Romans brought, such as roads. Many of these, splendidly paved, led out from Rome across the plains and over distant mountain passes to remote and inaccessible parts of the empire. It must be said that the Romans didn't build these roads out of considerations for the people living there. On the contrary, their aim was to send news and troops to all parts of the empire in the shortest possible time. The Romans were superb engineers. Most impressive of all their works were the magnificent aqueducts. These brought water from distant mountains and carried it down through the valleys and into the towns. Clear, fresh water to fill the innumerable fountains and bathhouses, so that Rome's provincial officials could enjoy all the comforts that they were used to having at home. A Roman citizen living abroad always retained his separate status, for he lived according to Roman law. Wherever he happened to be in that vast empire, he could turn to a Roman official and say, "I am a citizen of Rome." These words had the effect of a magic formula. If until then no one had paid him much attention, everyone would instantly become polite and obliging. In those days, however, the true rulers of the world were the Roman soldiers. It was they who held the gigantic empire together, suppressing revolts where necessary and ferociously punishing all those who dared oppose them. Courageous, experienced, and ambitious, they conquered a new land. To the north, to the south, to the east, almost every decade. People who saw the tight columns of well-drilled soldiers marching slowly in their metal-plated tunics with their shields and javelins, their slings and swords, and their catapults for hurling rocks and arrows, knew that it was useless to resist. War was their favorite pastime. After each victory, they returned in triumph to Rome, led by their generals with all of their captives and their loot. To the sound of trumpets, they would march past the cheering crowds through gates of honor and triumphant arches. Above their heads they held pictures and placards like billboards to advertise their victories. The general would stand tall in his chariot, a crown of laurel on his head, wearing his sacred cape worn by the statue of Jupiter, god of gods, in his temple. Like a second Jupiter, he would climb the steep path to the capital, the citadel of Rome, and there in the temple, high above the city, he would make his solemn sacrifice of thanksgiving to that god, while below him the leaders of the vanquished were put to death. A general who had many such victories with plenty of booty for his troops and land for them to cultivate when they grew old and were retired from service was loved by his men like a father. They would give their all for him, not just for foreign soil, but at home as well, for in their eyes a great hero on the battlefield was just what they needed to keep order at home, where there was often trouble brewing. For Rome had become a huge city with large numbers of destitute people who had no work and no money. If the provinces failed to send grain, it made famine in Rome. Two brothers living in 130 BC, that is 16 years after the destruction of Carthage, thought up a plan to encourage this multitude of poor and starving people to move to Africa and settle there as farmers. These brothers were the Gracchi, but they were both killed in the course of political struggles. And the same blind devotion that the soldiers gave their general went to any man who gave grain to the multitudes and put on splendid festivals. For the Romans loved festivals. But these were not like all of those put on by the Greeks, where leading citizens took part in sporting contests and sang hymns in honor of the father of the gods. These would have seemed ridiculous to any Roman. What serious, self-respecting man would sing in public, or take off his formal, many-pleated toga to throw javelins before an audience? Such things were best left to captives. It was they who had to wrestle and fight, confront wild beasts, and stage whole battles in the arena under the eyes of thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of spectators. It all got very serious and bloody, but that was just what made it so exciting for the Romans, especially when, instead of trained professionals, men who had been condemned to death were thrown into the arena to grapple with lions, bears, tigers, and even elephants. Anyone who put on shows like these with generous handouts of grain was loved by the crowd and could do what he pleased. As you can imagine, many tried. If true rivals fought for power, one might have an army and the patricians on his side, while the other had the support of the plebeians and the other poor peasants. And in a long drawn-out struggle, now one, now the other would have one would be uppermost. There were two such famous enemies called Marius and Sulla. Marius had been fighting in Africa, and several years later took his army to rescue the Roman Empire when it was in peril. In 113 BC, barbarians from the north had invaded Italy, as the Dorians had Greece, or several hundred years later, the Gauls had Rome. These invaders were the Cimbri, or the Teutons, ancestors of today's Germans. They had fought so bravely that they actually succeeded in putting the Roman legions to flight, but Marius and his army had been able to halt and defeat them. This made him the most celebrated man in Rome, but in the meantime Sulla had fought on in Africa, and he too in return triumphant. Both men got ready to fight it out. Marius had all of Sulla's friends killed. Sulla, in his turn, made a long list of the Romans who had supported Marius and had them murdered. He then generously presented all of their property to the state, after which he and his soldiers ruled the Roman Empire until 79 BC. In the course of these turbulent times, Romans had changed a great deal. All the peasants had gone. A handful of rich people had bought up smaller farms and brought in slaves to run their vast estates. Romans had, in fact, grown used to leaving everything to be managed by slaves. Not only those who worked in the mines and the quarries, but even the tutors of patrician children were mostly slaves, prisoners of war, or their descendants. They were treated as goods, bought and sold like cattle. Slave owners could do what they liked with their slaves, even kill them. Slaves had no rights at all. Some masters sold them to fight with wild beasts in the arena, where they were known as gladiators. On one occasion, the gladiators rebelled against this treatment. They were urged on by a slave called Spartacus, and many slaves from the country estates rallied to them. They fought with a ferocity born of desperation, and the Romans were hard put to suppress the revolt, for which the slaves paid a terrible price. That was 71 BC. By this time, new generals had become the darlings of the Roman populace, and the most popular of them all was Gaius Julius Caesar. He too knew how to win the hearts of the masses, and had raised colossal sums of money for the magnificent festivals and gifts of grain. But more than that, he was a truly great general, one of the greatest there had ever been. One day he went to war. A few days later, Rome received a letter from him with just 3 Latin words, Veni, Vidi, Vici, meaning, I came, I saw, I conquered. That was how fast he worked. He conquered France, in those days known as Gaul, and made it a province of Rome. This was no small feat, for the peoples who lived there were exceptionally brave and warlike, and not easily intimidated. The conquest took 7 years, from 58 to 51 BC. He fought against the Helvetii, who lived in what is now Switzerland, the Gauls and the Germans. Twice he crossed the Rhine into the land that is now part of Germany, and twice he crossed the sea to England, known to the Romans as Britannia. He did this to teach the neighboring tribes proper fear and respect for Rome. Although the Gauls continued to fight desperately for years on end, he attacked them repeatedly, and everywhere he went, he left troops into control behind him. Once Gaul had become a Roman province, the inhabitants soon learned to speak Latin, just as they had in Spain. And this is why French and Spanish, which come from the languages of the Romans, are known as the Romance languages. After the conquest of Gaul, Caesar turned his army towards Italy. He was now the most powerful man in the world. Other generals who had previously been his allies he attacked and defeated. And after he had seduced Cleopatra, the beautiful queen of Egypt, he was able to add Egypt to the Roman Empire. He then set about putting it in order. For this he was ideally suited, for he had an exceptionally orderly mind. He was able to dictate 2 letters at the same time without getting his thoughts in a tangle. Imagine that. He didn't just put the whole empire in order, he put time in order too. He put time in order? Whatever does that mean? He reformed the calendars so that it ended up being more or less like ours, with 12 months and leap years. It was called after him, the Julian calendar. And because he was such a great man, one of the months is also named after him, the month of July. So July takes its name after the thin-faced, bald-headed man who liked to wear a laurel wreath made of gold on his head, a man whose weak and sickly body had a shining intellect and a will of iron. Since Caesar was now the mightiest man on earth, he could have become the king of the Roman Empire, and he might not have objected to that, but the Romans were jealous of him, even his best friend Brutus, and they didn't want to be ruled by him. Fearing that Caesar would get the better of them, they decided to murder him. During a meeting in the Senate, they surrounded him and raised their daggers to stab him. Caesar defended himself, but when among his assailants he caught sight of Brutus, he is reported to have said, "You too, Brutus, my son?" and then let them strike him down. without making any further attempts to resist. This happened in 44 BC. After July comes August. Caesar Octavius Augustus was Caesar's adoptive son. Having fought for such a long time against a number of generals on land and at sea, he finally succeeded in becoming the sole ruler of the empire in 31 BC, and so became the first to hold the title of Roman Emperor. Since 1 month has been named after Julius Caesar, Augustus was given one too, and he'd certainly earned it. He may not have been extraordinary like Caesar, but he was a fair and prudent man who controlled himself at all times and had earned the right to control others. It is said that he never gave an order or made a decision in anger. Whenever he felt his temper rising, he slowly recited the alphabet in his head, and by the time that he reached the end, he had calmed down. This tells you what he was like, a cool-headed man, a man who ruled the empire fairly and wisely. He wasn't only a warrior, and he didn't only enjoy going to gladiator fights. He lived simply and appreciated fine sculpture and fine poetry. And because the Romans were less gifted than the Greeks at such things, he had copies made of all the finest Greek statues and placed them in his palaces and gardens. The Roman poets of his time, and they were the most famous of all Roman poets, also took the poems of the Greeks as their models. For even in those days, people thought that the most beautiful things came from Greece, and for the same reason it was considered a sign of distinction for a Roman to speak Greek, to read ancient Greek poets, and to collect Greek works of art. And this is lucky for us, for if they hadn't, we might never have come to heard about it. Have a good night, wee bro. And thank you, Jugalama, for the host. Jinya, if you're still listening, feel free to text me. Chapter 16, The Good News. Augustus ruled from 31 BC until AD 14, which tells you that Jesus Christ was born during his reign. He was born in Palestine, which was then a Roman province. You can read about the life and teachings of Jesus Christ in the Bible. You probably know the essentials of what he taught, that it doesn't matter if a person is rich or poor, or of a noble or humble birth, a master or a slave, a great thinker or a child. That all men are God's children, and that the love of this Father is infinite. That before him no man is without sin, but that God has pity on sinners. That what matters is not judgment, but mercy. You know what mercy is, the great giving and forgiving love of God. And that we should treat others as we hope God, our Father, will treat us. That is why Jesus said, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other one also. If someone takes your cloak, do not stop him from taking your tunic. Give to everyone who asks you, and if anyone takes what belongs to you, do not demand it back." And you know that Jesus spent just a short time traveling all over the country, preaching and teaching, healing the sick and comforting the poor, and he was accused of wanting to be a king of the Jews. And that, as a rebellious Jew, he was sentenced by a Roman official called Pontius Pilate to be nailed to a cross. This terrible punishment was only given to slaves, robbers, and members of subject peoples, not citizens of Rome. It was also seen as a dreadful humiliation. But Christ had taught that the world's worst sorrows had a meaning, that beggars, those in torment, the persecuted, the sick, and the suffering were blessed in their misfortune. And so it was that the Son of God, martyred and in agony, became for the first Christians the very symbol of his teaching. Today we can hardly imagine what that meant. The cross was even worse than the gallows, and this cross of shame became the symbol of the new teaching. Just imagine what a Roman official or soldier, or a Roman teacher trapped in Greek culture, proud of his wisdom, his rhetoric, and his knowledge of philosophy, would have thought when he heard of Christ's teachings from one of the great preachers, perhaps the Apostle Paul in Athens or in Rome. We can read what he preached there today in the first letter to the Corinthians. "I will show you a more excellent way. If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am a resounding gong or a tinkling cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can see into all mysteries and have all knowledge and have all faith that I can move mountains, but I have not love, then I am nothing. If I give away everything that is mine and offer up my body to be burnt, but have not love, I gain nothing. Love is long-suffering and kind. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not behave improperly. It does not seek its own advantage. It is not easily provoked. It bears no grudge, delights not in evil, but rejoices only in the truth. It shelters all, trusts all, always hopes, always endures. Love is everlasting. When they heard Paul's sermons, the Roman patricians must have shaken their heads in disapproval, for this was hardly the language of the law. But the poor and downtrodden heard Paul's words, something that was entirely new, something that had never been heard before, the extraordinary announcement of divine grace, which was far greater than any law, and was called the gospel, or the good news. Good news, or glad tidings, is a translation of the Greek euangelion, from which we get the word evangelical. And this good and happy news about the mercy of God the Father, the unique and invisible God in whom the Jews had believed long before Christ had lived and preached among them, soon spread throughout the Roman Empire. Roman officials began to pay attention. As you know, they hadn't previously involved themselves in matters of religion, but this was something new. The Christians who believed in just one God were refusing to scatter incense before the images of the emperor, which had been the custom since Rome had an emperor. Like the rulers of the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Babylonians, and the Persians, Roman emperors allowed themselves to be worshipped as gods. Their statues were everywhere, and every good citizen was expected to place a few perfumed grains in front of these images as an offering. But the Christians were refusing to do so, and people wanted to make them. Now, about 30 years after Christ's death on the cross, that is, about 60 years after his birth, AD 60, a cruel emperor was rolling over the Roman Empire. He was called Nero. People still shudder when they hear that name because of this monster. But what is truly repellent about him is that he didn't start out as a monster, ruthless and wicked through and through. He was simply weak, vain, suspicious, and lazy. Nero fancied himself as a poet and composed songs which he performed himself. He ate, or rather gorged himself on the rarest delicacies, and was utterly devoid of decency or dignity, He was not unattractive, but there was something cruel and self-satisfied about his smile. He had his own mother murdered, and his wife and his tutor, along with a number of other relations and friends. He lived in constant fear of assassination, for he was a coward too. One day a terrible fire broke out in Rome, which, burning day and night, consumed house after house, district after district, and made hundreds of thousands of people homeless, for by then Rome was a huge city with more than 1 million inhabitants. And what do you think Nero did? He stood on the balcony of his sumptuous palace with his lyre and sang a song that he had composed about the burning of Troy. To him this seemed perfect for the occasion. The people, however, were enraged. Until then they had not hated him because he had always given them splendid festivals, and he had only been cruel to close friends and acquaintances. Now the rumor spread that Nero himself had set Rome on fire. We do not know if it is true, but in any case Nero knew that people thought he was responsible. So he looked around for a scapegoat, and he found one in the Christians. The Christians had often said that this world must end so that a better, purer world might take its place. Of course, you and I know that they meant heaven. But because people tend not to listen very carefully, soon they were saying, the Christians want the world to end because they hate mankind. An extraordinary accusation, don't you think? Nero had them arrested wherever he found them, and they were brutally put to death. Some were torn to pieces by wild beasts in the arena, while others were burnt alive as torches in the grand nocturnal banquet in his garden. But the Christians bore all these tortures and those of later persecutions with unbelievable courage. They were proud to testify to the power of their new faith, and these testifiers, or martyrs to use the Greek word, later became the first saints. Christians used to pray at the tombs of their martyrs, whom they buried in a whole network of underground passages and burial chambers called catacombs outside the city gates. The walls were painted with simple pictures inspired by Bible stories, pictures of Daniel in the lion's den, or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the burning fiery furnace, or Moses striking water from the rock, which was to remind Christians that the power of God and of life everlasting. In these underground passages, Christians gathered together at night to discuss Christ's teachings, to share the Lord's Supper, and to give each other encouragement when a new persecution threatened. And in the course of the next century, despite all the persecution, more and more men and women throughout the empire came to believe in the good news and were ready to bear for its own sake the suffering that Christ endured. Christians were not the only ones to experience the severity of Roman rule, for things were no better for the Jews. A few years after Nero's reign, a revolt against the Romans broke out in Jerusalem. The Jews wanted their freedom. They fought with extraordinary determination and courage against the legions who were forced to lay siege to each Jewish town and in turn to defeat them. Jerusalem itself was reduced to famine for 2 long years of siege by Titus, son of the ruling Roman Emperor Vespasian. Those who fled were caught and crucified by the Romans outside the city. When the Romans finally succeeded in forcing their way into the city in AD 70, Titus is said to have commanded that the sanctuary of the one God be spared, but the soldiers sacked and looted the temple all the same. The sacred vessels were carried home in triumph to Rome, and as we can see today from the pictures carved on the ark which Titus erected in Rome to commemorate his triumph. Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews scattered to the 4 winds. Long established as traders in many cities, the Jews had lost their homeland. From now on, they huddled together in their prayer schools in cities like Alexandria and Rome and other foreign towns, scorned and derided, all because, even in the midst of heathens, they still clung to their ancient customs, reading the Bible and waiting for their Messiah who was to save them. And hello, Unknown Ark. We're doing okay. Doing a reading of A Little History of the World by Ernst Gombrich. I apologize for not responding right away, but I'm trying not to break up the narrative, so I'll take a minute between chapters to talk to everybody. How's everybody doing with the story, by the way? We're probably about a little over 2 hours into the broadcast now. Let's get the feeling on this. Does anybody want to hear any more chapters? I'll just give it a minute while everybody replies. Oh, glad to read that. Unknown Ark. That's good to hear. I actually still haven't played Agario, so. Alright, I'm not quite sure how everybody's doing on this, but let's read Chapter 17, Life in the Empire and at its Frontiers. If you weren't a Christian, a Jew, or a close relative of the Emperor, life in the Roman Empire could be peaceful and pleasant. You could travel from Spain to the Euphrates, from the Danube to the Nile on wonderful Roman roads. The name of this book is A Little History of the World, Jaspu. The Roman Postal Service made regular visits to the settlements at the Empire's frontiers, carrying news back and forth. In all the great cities like Alexandria or Rome, you could find everything you needed for a comfortable life. Of course, in Rome, there were whole districts of barrack-like buildings, crudely built, many stories high, where poor people lived. Private houses and villas of the well-to-do, in contrast, were luxuriously furnished with beautiful Greek works of art and had delightful small gardens with cooling fountains. In winter months, rooms were warmed by a form of central heating in which hot air circulated through the hollow bricks under the floor. Every rich Roman had several country houses, usually near the sea, with many slaves to run them, and fine libraries with the works of all the best Greek and Latin poets were to be found. The villas of the rich even had their own sports grounds and cellars stocked with the best wines. If a Roman felt bored, he would take himself to the marketplace, the law courts, or to the baths. The bathhouses, or the therms, were monumental buildings supplied by aqueducts with water from distant mountains. They were magnificently furnished and decorated and had halls and for hot baths, cold baths and steam baths, and others for practicing sports. Ruins of these colossal therms can still be seen, with their high vaulted ceilings, their brightly colored marble pillars, and their pools tiled with rare and precious stones. They look more like fairy tale palaces. Bigger still, and even more impressive, were the theaters. The great amphitheater in Rome, known as the Colosseum, held up to 50,000 spectators. Few of our modern stadiums could hold more. They were mainly used for gladiatorial contests and animal baiting, and you remember many Christians died there. The tiers of the seats for the spectators rose high above the arena, like a giant oval funnel. Imagine the noise that 50,000 people must have made when they were all in there together. The emperor sat below the royal box beneath a magnificent awning to protect him from the sun. When he dropped his handkerchief into the arena, it was the signal for the games to begin. The gladiators would appear, and standing in front of the imperial blocks, cry, "Hail Caesar! We who are about to die salute you." But you mustn't imagine that the emperors did nothing but sit in amphitheaters, or that they were layabouts and raving lunatics like Nero. On the contrary, they spent most of their time maintaining peace in the empire. Beyond the distant frontiers, all around were fierce barbarian tribes, waiting to raid and pillage the rich provinces. The Germans, who lived to the north and the other side of the Danube and the Rhine, were especially troublesome. Caesar had already clashed with them during his conquest of Gaul. Tall and powerfully built, they towered over the Romans and frightened the life out of them. Not only that, but their country, now Germany, was in those days a land of swamps and dark forests, which the Roman legions were forever losing their way in. But above all, the Germans simply weren't used to living in the fine, centrally heated villas. They were peasants and herdsmen, as the Romans themselves had once been, and they preferred to live as they always had, isolated in wooden farmsteads. Educated Romans from cities liked to write about the great simplicity of the Germanic way of life, the plainness and austerity of their traditions, their love of warfare, and their loyalty to their chieftains. By drawing attention to their seemingly simple, uncorrupted, and natural way of life and their freedom of the forest, the authors of the accounts which have come down to us warned their fellow countrymen against what they saw as the Romans' own dangerously refined and self-indulgent way of life. The German warriors really were dangerous enemies. The Romans had already learnt to their cost during Augustus' rule. At that time, the leader of a Germanic tribe called the Cherusci was a man called Arminius. Brought up in Rome, he knew all about Roman military tactics, and one day when a Roman army was marching through the Tuborg forest, he ambushed it and annihilated it completely. After that, the Romans kept out of the region. But it was all the more vital for them to secure their frontiers against the Germans. Although during the 1st century AD, they did what the Emperor Shi Hung Tai did in China. They built a wall, known as the Limes, along the length of the frontier from the Rhine to the Danube. This wall, made of palisades with watchtowers and ditches, was intended to protect the empire from the nomadic Germanic tribes. For what worried the Romans most was that instead of staying quietly on their farmsteads, cultivating their land, the tribes were always on the move looking for new hunting grounds or new pastures. They simply loaded their wives and their children into ox carts and set off in search of somewhere to live. This meant that the Romans had to keep troops permanently stationed at the frontiers to defend the empire. Along the Rhine and near the Danube, there were soldiers from every country under the sun. Near Vienna, there was an encampment of Egyptians, who even built themselves a temple beside the Danube, which they dedicated to their god Isis. On that spot, there is a town today called Yibs, and Isis lives on in that name. Among other frontier guards, many number of other gods were worshipped. The Persian sun god Mithras, for example, and not long after, a unique and invisible god of the Christians. However, life in these outposts was not very different from life in Rome. Today we can still find Roman theaters and bathhouses in Germany, in Cologne, Trier, Augsburg, and Regensburg, in Austria, in Salzburg and Vienna, in France, in Arles and Nimes, and in England, in Bath, together with villas for imperial officers and barracks for the soldiers. Other soldiers often bought themselves land in the district, married a local girl, and settled near the camp. As a result, the population within the provinces gradually became accustomed to the Roman presence, while those who lived beyond the Rhine and the Danube became increasingly restless as the years went by. It wasn't long before Roman emperors were spending more time on the frontier towns than in their palaces in Rome. Among them were some remarkable men, one of whom was the Emperor Trajan. He lived about 100 years after Christ, and long after his death, people were still talking about his justice and his gentleness. Trajan's troops had crossed the Danube once again into what is now Hungary and Romania. Making that land a Roman province would also make the empire safer. The country they conquered was known as Dacia. Once it had become Roman and its inhabitants began to speak Latin, Dacia became Romania. But Trajan didn't only just lead military expeditions. He made Rome beautiful with glorious squares. Whole hills were leveled to make room for them. When he commissioned a Greek architect to build temples and shops, law courts, colonnades, and monuments. You can still see these ruins in Rome today. The emperors who followed Trajan took great care of their empire and defended its frontiers, especially the emperor Marcus Aurelius, who reigned from 161 to 180 and spent much of his time in garrisons on the Danube, at Cartenum and at Vinidoba, which is what Vienna used to be called. And Marcus Aurelius hated war. He was a gentle, quiet man, a philosopher who loved nothing better than reading or writing. We still have the diary that he kept, much of which is written during his campaigns. Almost everything he wrote in it was about self-control and tolerance, about enduring pain and hardship, and about the silent heroism of the thinker. They are thoughts that would have pleased the Buddha. But Marcus Aurelius couldn't retire into the forest to meditate. He had to wage war in the countrysides near Vienna against the Germanic tribes, who were particularly restless at that time. The Romans were said to have taken lions with them to scare off the enemy from across the Danube, but since the Germans had never seen lions before, they weren't frightened at all. They just killed what they thought were large dogs. When those battles were going on, Marcus Aurelius died suddenly in his headquarters in Vibidona. This was in AD 180. The emperors who succeeded him spent even more time at the frontiers and even less in Rome. They were true soldiers, elected by their troops and often dismissed or even killed by them too. Many of these emperors weren't Romans, but foreigners, for by now the legions had only a very small number of Romans in them. The Italian peasants, who in earlier times had gone out to conquer the world as soldiers, had virtually disappeared, while their farms had been absorbed into huge estates by the rich and managed by foreign slaves, and the army was also made up of foreigners. You remember the Egyptians by the Danube. Most of these soldiers were Germans, who, as you know, were also excellent warriors. And it was these foreign troops, stationed at all four corners of the vast empire, at the frontiers of Germania and Persia and in Spain, Britain, North Africa, Egypt, Asia Minor, and Romania, who now chose their favorite generals to be emperors. They all fought for power and had each other murdered, just as in the time with Marius Sulla. Confusion and misery reigned in those years after AD 200. In the Roman Empire, there was almost no one to keep order but slaves or foreign troops who couldn't understand one another. The peasants in the provinces were unable to pay their taxes and rose up against their landowners. In those desperate times, when the land was in the grip of pestilence and lawlessness, many found consolation in the good news of the gospel. More and more free men and slaves became Christians and refused to make sacrifices to the emperor. At the height of the crisis, a man from a poor family succeeded in wresting control from the empire. This was the Emperor Diocletian. He came to power in 284 and set about trying to rebuild the empire, which was by now in ruins. Famine was everywhere, so he fixed a limit on the price of all foods. Realizing that the empire could no longer be governed from a single place, he chose 4 towns as his new imperial capitals and placed a deputy, or prefect, in each. To restore respect and dignity to the role of the emperor, he introduced new rituals and court ceremony and magnificent, rich embroidered robes for his courtiers and officials. He was particularly insistent that people should make sacrifices to the emperor, and so he ruthlessly persecuted Christians throughout the empire. This was the last and the most violent of all the persecutions. After the reign of more than 20 years, Diocletian renounced his imperial title and retired a sick man to his palace in Dalmatia. There he lived long enough to see the futility of his battle against Christianity. It is said that his successor, Emperor Constantine, abandoned his struggle on the eve of the battle against his rival Maxentius. He had a dream in which he saw the cross, and he heard the words, "Beneath this sign you will be victorious." Victorious in that battle, he issued a decree in 313 that Christians should no longer be persecuted. He himself remained a pagan for a long time and was only baptized on his deathbed. Constantine no longer ruled the empire from Rome. In those days, the chief threat came from the east, and so the Persians having once again become powerful. So he chose the seat of the ancient Greek colony of Byzantium on the Black Sea, upon which he renamed Constantine's city, or Constantinople. Today it is known as Istanbul. By 395, the Roman Empire didn't just have 2 capitals, it had 2 states. The Western Empire, consisting of Italy, Gaul, Britannia, Spain, North Africa, where people spoke Latin, and the Eastern Empire, consisting of Egypt, Palestine, Asia Minor, Greece, and Macedonia, where they spoke Greek. In both sides, Christianity became the official religion from 380 onwards. This meant that bishops and archbishops became important dignitaries who wielded great influence in the affairs of the state. Christians no longer met in underground passages, but in grand churches with fine pillars, and the cross, the symbol of deliverance from suffering, now became the legion's battle emblem. How's everybody doing? Thank you, 1-4. This is something special we were doing because I had a short stream on Monday, so I'm glad you're enjoying it. And obviously we've got some people writing it out, but for those of you who are new here, we are reading Ernst Gombrich, or E.H. Gombrich, A Little History of the World. It is published by Yale University Press, I believe? Yes. I'm guessing people would like some more? There's a bit of a delay for chat, so I'll do at least one more chapter, and we'll see how people are feeling about it partway through. It's been great so far. Don't really know that much about it. Well, actually, yeah, so I'll take a minute to explain this book. So Unknown Ark, this is actually one of the first books that I read in my effort to kind of learn the history that I think an educated modern individual should know. And it's actually challenging to try and find a single account of history. Most history books tend to be very specialized. And so I actually picked up this book, which is, I knew of the author from an art history book. But this is one of the first things that he wrote, and it was actually, it's intended for children, but I think it does a very wonderful description of some parts. So. Oh, that's wonderful, 1-4. All right, looks like there's a consensus about the story. So again, as the disclaimer says, I am reading chat as I read, but I'm not going to respond until I have these little intermissions between chapters. So, Chapter 18, The Storm. Have you ever watched a storm approaching on a hot summer's day? It's especially spectacular in the mountains. At first there's nothing to see, but you feel a sort of weariness that tells you that something is in the air. Then you hear thunder, a rumble here and there. You can't quite tell where it's coming from, and all of a sudden the mountains seem strangely near. There isn't a breath of wind, yet dense clouds pile up in the sky, and now the mountains have almost vanished behind a wall of haze. Clouds rush in to form at all sides, but still there's no wind. There's more thunder now, and everything around looks eerie and menacing. You wait, and then suddenly it erupts. At first it is almost a release, and then the storm descends into the valley. There's thunder and lightning everywhere. The rain clatters down in huge drops. The storm is trapped in the narrow cleft in the valley, and the thunderclaps echo and reverberate off the steep mountain sides. The wind buffets you from every angle, and when the storm finally moves away, leaving it in its place a clear, still, starlit night, you can hardly remember where those thunderstorms were, let alone which thunderclap belonged to which flash of lightning. The time I am now going to tell you was like that. It was a time when the storm that broke... it was then a storm that broke and that swept away the whole vast Roman Empire. We've already heard its rumblings. They were the movements of the Germanic tribes at the frontiers, the incursions of the Cimbri and the Teutons, and the campaigns led by Caesar, Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and many others in their efforts to keep the tribes out of the empire. But now the storm had come. It had started at the other end of the world, almost as far away as the wall built by the Chinese Emperor Shi Hongti, the enemy of history. No longer able to mount their raids on China, Asiatic hordes from the steppes had turned westwards in search of new lands to plunder. This time it was the Huns. People like these had never been seen before in the West, small yellow men with narrow slit eyes and terrifying scars on their faces. Half men, half horse they seemed, for they rarely dismounted from their small, fast ponies. They slept on horseback, held meetings on horseback, and ate on horseback, the raw meat that they had made first tender under their saddles. With fearful howls of a noise like thunder, they charged down on their foes, showering them with arrows before whirling around and rushing away as if in headlong retreat. Then, if they were followed, they would twist in their saddles and shoot backwards at their pursuers. They were nimbler, more cunning, and more bloodthirsty than any of the other tribes. Even the brave Germans fled before them. One of those Germanic tribes, the Visigoths or West Goths, sought refuge in the Roman Empire, which agreed to accept them. However, it wasn't long before they were at war with their hosts. They marched as far as Athens, which they sacked. They also marched on Constantinople. Finally, under the leadership of their king Alaric, they turned towards Italy, where they besieged and sacked Rome in 410. When Alaric died, they went north, this time to Gaul and eventually to Spain, where they settled. In order to defend themselves against the armies, the Romans were forced to recall large numbers of their troops from the frontier garrisons in Gaul and Britannia, and from the Rhine and the Danube. Seizing their chance, the other Germanic tribes now burst through the empire in many places. It was the moment that they had been waiting for all those hundreds of years. Some had names that you can still see reflected on a map of Germany today. Swabians, Franks, and Alemanni. Across the Rhine they came, the creaking of ox carts piled high with wives and children on all their goods and chattels. They fought and they conquered. For when they fell, there were always more behind them to take their place. Thousands were slain, but tens of thousands followed. This period is known as the time of the migrations. It was the storm that swept up the Roman Empire and whirled it to extinction. For the Germanic tribes didn't stop when they reached Gaul and Spain. The Vandals, for instance, captured Carthage in 439 and used it as a base from which they launched their pirate ships to loot and burn the coastal towns. They ravaged Sicily and crossed into Italy. Today we still talk of vandalism, even though the Vandals were really no worse than many others. As for the Huns, they were worse. They now had a new king, Attila. In 444 he was at the height of his power. Can you remember who was in power 440 years before Christ's birth? Pericles in Athens. Those were the best of times, but Attila in every way was his opposite. People said that wherever he trod, the grass ceased to grow. His hordes burnt and destroyed everything in their path. And yet in spite of all the gold and silver treasure that the Huns looted, and in spite of the magnificent finery worn by their leaders, Attila himself remained a plain man. He ate off wooden plates, and he lived in a simple tent. Gold and silver meant nothing to him. Power was what mattered. It is said that he never laughed. He was a fearsome sovereign who had conquered half the world, and those he didn't kill had to fight for him. His army was immense. Many of the soldiers were Germans, largely East Goths or Ostrogoths, for by this time the Visigoths had settled in Spain. From his camp in Hungary, he sent an envoy to the Emperor of the Roman Empire of the West the following message. My lord and your lord Attila bids me to tell you that you will give him half of your empire and your daughter to be his wife. When the emperor refused, Attila set out to punish him with his mighty army and take by force what had been denied him. The two sides met in a tremendous battle in the Capuletian plains in Gaul in 451. All the armies of the Roman Empire, assisted by Germanic troops, joined forces to repel the barbarian horde. The outcome being undecided, Attila turned towards Rome. Appalled and panic-stricken, the Romans could only look on as the Huns approached. Nearer and nearer they came, and no army was there to save them. It was at this point that one man dared to defy Attila and his host. This was Pope Leo, known as Leo the Great. With priests and holy banners, he went out to meet him. Everybody waited for the Huns to strike them down, but Attila was persuaded to turn back. He left Italy, and this time Rome was saved. Only 2 years later, in 453, Attila managed to marry a German princess and died on the same night. Had the Pope not saved the Roman Empire of the West on that occasion, it would have ceased to exist. For by this time the emperors had lost all authority, and such power as remained was in the hands of the soldiers, most of whom were Germans. The day came when the soldiers found that they could do without an emperor, and so they decided to depose him. The last Roman emperor had a rather remarkable name, Augustulus. A curious coincidence that Rome's founder and its first king was called Romulus, and the first Roman emperor was Emperor Augustus. Augustulus, the last one, was deposed in 476. In his place, a German general called Ottokar proclaimed himself kings of the Germans in Italy. This marked the end of the Roman Empire of the West and its Latin culture, together with the long period that goes along all the way back to prehistoric times, which we call antiquity. So the date 476 marks the birth of a new era, the Middle Ages, given its name for no other reason than it falls between antiquity and modern times. But at the time, nobody noticed that a new era had begun. Everything was just as confusing as before. The Ostrogoths, who had previously fought alongside the army of the Huns, had settled in the Roman Empire to the east. The Roman Emperor of the East, wishing to be rid of them, suggested that they might do better if they went to the Empire of the West and had conquered Italy. So in 493, led by their great king, Theodoric, the Ostrogoths went to Italy. There, the battle-hardened soldiers made short work of the wretched war-torn land. Theodoric captured Odoacer, but he promised to spare his life. Instead, he invited him to a banquet and stabbed him to death. It has always puzzled me that Theodoric could have done something so monstrous, because in many other ways he was truly a great ruler, a man of real merit and distinction. He made sure that the Goths lived in peace with the Italians, and he gave his warriors no more than one piece of land each to farm. He chose Ravenna, a harbor town of northern Italy, to be his capital, and he built beautiful churches decorated with wonderful, brightly colored mosaics. This is all quite unexpected, that the Ostrogoths might succeed in building themselves a mighty and prosperous kingdom in Italy. One that might one day would pose a threat to the imperial rule in Constantinople is something that never would have occurred to the emperor to the east, who would have regretted his advice. From 527 onwards, Constantinople was ruled by a mighty, luxury-loving, and ambitious sovereign, whose name was Justinian. The Emperor Justinian was possessed by one great ambition. This was to rule over the whole Roman Empire and unite it under his rule. His court had all the splendor of the East. His wife Theodora was a former circus dancer, and they both wore heavy robes of jewel-encrusted silk with great ropes of gold and pearls around their necks, which must have made a tremendous swishing and jangling sound when they moved. In Constantinople, Justinian built a gigantic church with a huge dome on top called the Hagia Sophia, and did his utmost to revive the lost grandeur of ancient Rome. He began making a collection of all the laws of ancient Rome together with the many commentaries made by the great scholars and legislators. This great book of Roman law is known as the Pandex of Justinian. Even today, anyone who plans to become a lawyer or a judge should read it, as it forms the basis of many of our laws. After Theodoric's death, Justinian tried to drive the Goths out of Italy and conquer the country, but the Goths put up a heroic defense and held out for decades. Given that they were in a foreign land whose inhabitants were also hostile to them, this was no easy task. Moreover, although they were Christians, their beliefs were unlike those of their opponents. For instance, they did not believe in the Trinity, the existence of one God in three persons, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so they were attacked and persecuted as unbelievers as well. In the end, most of the Goths were killed in these battles, and after the last battle, those who were left, an army of less than 1,000 men, were allowed to disband without reprisal and vanished away towards the north. This was the end of that great tribe, the Ostrogoths. Now Justinian ruled over Ravenna as well. He built wonderful churches there which he had decorated with splendid portraits of his wife and himself. But the rulers of the Empire of the East didn't stay long in Italy. In 586, new Germanic peoples called the Lombards came down from the north. The land was conquered yet again, and today part of Italy is still called Lombardy after them. This was the last great rumble of the storm. Then slowly the clouds parted to reveal the starry night that is the Middle Ages. And that is it for me today, folks. The next chapter is The Starry Night Begins, which moves us into the Middle Ages, and I think that's a good time. I think that's a good place to start for next time. So as a recap of the previous sessions, the first video covers prehistory up to the Greek defeat of the Persians. The first part that we started, and then this particular VOD, so parts 2 and 3, cover the East. So they cover things like the Peloponnesian War, but they also cover India and China. They take us through the Roman Empire, and they take us up to the Middle Ages. So what we will very likely do for the next read-through will be to do the Middle Ages, and I think it goes up to, I think the Renaissance starts around chapter 26, so that gives me about 7 chapters, which is roughly what we covered here. So, yeah, I'm sorry, Jazzpoo, I know you want more, but I want to thank everybody for hanging out. I know I'm not, actually we can put a little bit more music back up. I want to take a second to thank everybody. It's always nice to have somebody in the channel, especially when I do something new. We actually got some new followers out of this, so if you're still in the channel, thanks a lot for showing your support. Also some people following again from... what's interesting is that after the whole conquering phase that Europe went through, somehow all these tribes, clans, and empire formed all these European nations. There's so much they want to know and don't understand. Well, Unknown Arc, this is not a bad book to pick up, and the thing that I would recommend with this book is to take the stories that you find interesting, and you can use it as a launch pad for studying the parts that you found interesting. So for instance, I picked up a book called 1688, The First Modern Revolution, because I'm very interested in the early modern period, and specifically the Glorious Revolution, which is what that book is about. But of course, if I don't appreciate the context in which the Glorious Revolution happened, if I don't understand how if I don't understand things such as the Protestant Reformation or the English Civil War, if I don't understand the difference between Charles I and Charles II, and the reason why James was a king that people feared, then the Glorious Revolution doesn't make as much sense. And so in that case, I think a book like this is good to give you the broad strokes, and then you can pick up specialist material. Yes, so yeah, looks like chat's doing a good job of letting people know what it is, but this is E.H. Gombrich, Ernst Gombrich's A Little History of the World. I will also let you know if you want to bug Jessie Quill, who I hope is still in chat, but if she isn't, this is even better because she's not going to hear me say this. But she has a copy of this book in the original German, so you can maybe suggest to her that it would be fun to... it would be fun to get her to read it in the original language. Anyways, guys, that is it for me. I'm going to take a minute here to find somebody to host. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out. It was fun to read this. We'll definitely do this again. I don't know exactly when, but it'll be good to go a little bit further into the story. We are going to read the whole book, and I will make sure that I make highlights so that people can go back and listen to it if they want. And with that in mind, who can we host? I know who we're hosting. We're going to host Ponce. What an introduction to Ponce, eh? So Ponce is a League of Legends streamer. He is a fantastic guy, fellow Vancouverite. He's actually, so if you're interested in history, he actually has a really good short little history on barbecue and its origins in France, I believe under Louis XIV. So what I'd like is, I know Jazzpoo really wants me to do raids with, like a proper raid with dialogue, so I'm going to give you the link here. Feel free to copy and paste that saying inside chat to let him know that you've come from this channel. I do recommend that you hang out for a little bit. I know League of Legends isn't for everybody, but I think he is a very good caster. I think he's a really great guy, so it'd be great if you could just show a little bit of support. If it's not exactly your thing, that's fine. Obviously, you don't need to stay around, but if you can just take a minute to give him some support and just give it a chance, I think that'd be a great way to maybe see something new. As for me, that's